Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Patriot's History of the United States. I'm co-author, Patriot's History of the United States with Michael Allen. It's probably a good time. We're 66 lessons into this now. And if you're just kind of joining in the middle or something, I just thought I'd update everybody about how this came to be. In the early 1990s, Michael and I were both professors. He at the University of Washington, Tacoma, I at the University of Dayton. We taught a lot of U.S. history courses, and we couldn't find a textbook that we liked at all. So we met at a Western history conference, I think it was in Albuquerque, around 1990, 91, 92. At my age, it really gets hard to figure out exactly when some of these things happen. But at any rate, we decided we were going to consider writing a textbook. And we did. We started up in about 1999. Took us about 5 years. Now, you got to remember, we both had written a lot. I had already written maybe 10 books. He had written 5 or 6 on different topics. So it all fit together. As Rocky said in the movie Rocky, gaps. We all got gaps. You got gaps. I got gaps. We fill gaps. So we filled gaps, and we did find a publisher. We really thought we were going to have to publish it ourselves out of the back of a van and sell it with other bootleg items like plastic straws out of California. But at any rate, we got a publisher, Sentinel, an arm of Penguin. And it came out in 2004 and did really, really good. And long story short, in 2010, I was on the Glenn Beck show when he had a mass viewing, bigger than Tucker ever had at Fox. And he started holding the book up on TV every night. His best history book ever written. You got to get this book. Book ended up going to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. And it stayed there for over a month. This is a 1,000-page nonfiction book. So that took some doing. But anyway, it's now become the most popular homeschooling textbook. And if you cut out all the subsidies from the universities that Howard Zinn got for his book, we would easily be the #1 U.S. history book in America. But of course, we're fighting college professors who will require the book for their courses and sell 30, 40 every single class. That's kind of hard to keep up with, but we're doing pretty well. All right, so as always, I am reading from the 15th anniversary edition. If you have an earlier edition, before the 10th edition, you're probably going to have trouble lining things up in terms of both the pages and the headers. After the 10th, you'll be all right with headers, if not the pages. So all I can say is hunt and peck around. You'll find it. We're in the chapter called Small Republic, Big Shoulders. And I am at the header, Judiciary Waterloo for Minimalist Government. And that is on page 172. Now, before I do that, let me remind you, these are all free. I've done now 66 of these lessons. They're all free. They will continue to be free. But I need your help. We're trying to turn Patriot's history into a feature film like Sound of Freedom. I need your help. If you like what I'm doing here, just go on the Wild World of History site and buy me a coffee, or buy me 10, or if you're really generous, buy me 100. I don't care. But kick in a coffee or two and help us make this movie. It'd be greatly appreciated. All right, let's get started. So page 172, Judiciary Waterloo for Minimalist Government. While the Federalists in Congress and the bureaucracy ran before the flood of Jeffersonian Democrats, one branch of government definitely stood its ground. The lifetime appointees to the judiciary branch, the United States federal courts and Supreme Court, remained staunchly Federalist. Jefferson faced a choice: He could let judges alone and wait for age and attrition to ultimately create a new Republican judiciary, or he could adopt a more aggressive policy. He chose the latter course with mixed results. Much of Jefferson's vendetta against the Federalist judges came from bitterness over John Adams's last 2 years in office. Federalist judges had unfairly convicted and sentenced Republican editors under the Sedition Act. I think almost everybody on almost all sides of the political aisle agree that the Sedition Acts were unconstitutional and were not helpful. The Alien Act was thoroughly legitimate, no problem there. But the Sedition Acts were kind of what we are seeing today, if you catch my drift. Adams and the lame duck Congress added insult to injury by passing a new Judiciary Act and appointing a whopping 60 new Federalist judges, including Chief Justice John Marshall, during Adams's last 60 days in office. Jefferson now sought to legally balance the federal courts. The Virginian might have adopted an even more incendiary policy because his most extreme advisors advocated repealing all prior judiciary acts, clearing the courts of all Federalist judges, and appointing all Republicans to take their place. That would have been stupid. Instead, the administration wisely chose to remove only the midnight judges and a select few sitting judges. With the Amendatory Act, the new Republican Congress repealed Adams's 1801 Judiciary Act and eliminated 30 of Adams's 47 new justices of the peace, including a fellow named William Marbury, and 3 federal appeals court judgeships. Attempts to impeach several Federalist judges, including Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase, met with mixed results. Chase engaged in arguably unprofessional conduct in several of the Sedition Act cases, but the attempt to remove him proved so partisan and unprofessional that Republican moderates joined the minority Federalists to acquit Chase. Congressional Republicans won a skirmish with the Amendatory Act, but the Federalists under Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall ultimately won the war. This victory came thanks to a subtle and complex decision in a case known as Marbury v. Madison, 1803, and stemmed from the appointment of William Marbury as a midnight judge. Adams had commissioned Marbury as a justice of the peace, but Marbury never received the commission, and when he inquired about it, he was told by the Secretary of State's office that it had vanished. Marbury then sued Secretary of State James Madison in a brief he filed before the United States Supreme Court itself. By the way, when we're done with this section, probably next time, I will read the Marbury v. Madison case. Chief Justice Marshall wrote an 1803 opinion in Marbury that brilliantly avoided conflict with Jefferson while simultaneously setting a precedent for judicial review, the prerogative of the Supreme Court, not the executive or legislative branches, to decide the constitutionality of federal laws. There is nothing in the U.S. Constitution that grants the Supreme Court this great power, and in fact that we accept it today as a given has grown from the precedent of John Marshall's landmark decision. Marshall sacrificed his fellow Federalist Marbury for the greater cause of a strong centralized judiciary. He and fellow justices ruled the Supreme Court could not order Marbury commissioned because they lacked jurisdiction in the case, then shrewdly continued to make a ruling anyway. The Supreme Court, the Supreme Court lacked jurisdiction, Marshall ruled, because a 1789 federal law granting such jurisdiction was unconstitutional. The case should have originated in a lower court. While the ruling is abstruse, its aim and result were not. The Supreme Court said Marshall was the final arbiter of the constitutionality of federal laws. In Fletcher v. Peck, 1811, Marshall's court would claim the same national authority over state law, namely, the U.S. Supreme Court can determine whether state laws fit with the U.S. Constitution, which they must. Chief Justice Marshall thus paved the first segment of a long road toward nationalism through judicial review. Of course, the founders had wrestled with the notion of a court becoming the final arbiter of what the Constitution meant. Robert Yates, an anti-federalist delegate from New York to the Constitutional Convention, writing essays in the New York Journal under the name Brutus, warned that regardless of the assurances of the Federalists, the judges would, quote, give the sense of every article of the Constitution that may come before them, and in their decisions, quote, they will not confine themselves to any fixed or established rules, but will determine according to what appears to them the reason and spirit of the Constitution. That was all in emphasis in the original. I'm sorry, emphasis ours. Yates had astutely predicted in 1788 where the trail would end. Judges, quote, will be able to extend the limits of the general government gradually and by insensible degrees. One adjudication will form a precedent for the next, and this to the following one. Jefferson understood the dangers as well, and his criticism of Marbury versus Madison grew more heated over time. Writing in 1820, Jefferson warned that, quote, to consider the judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions is a very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. Well, it was Jefferson's Republican colleague, James Madison, who said, in essence, somebody's got to decide. Someplace in government, we have to have some source, whether it's president, Congress, courts, what is and what is not constitutional. And given the number of cases that the Supreme Court takes, which is something like 1% of the cases brought to it, you can see that it would be impossible for the Congress to rule on the constitutionality of its own laws. Second, it would just be too incredibly time-consuming for a president to rule on this. So Madison thought that while undesirable, it was, in fact, the only way out. It was inevitable. Madison said that the Supreme Court will ultimately end up deciding the constitutional rightness or wrongness of laws. And so that's really where we are today. Equally as important as judicial review, however, Marshall's court constantly ruled in favor of capitalism, free enterprise, and open markets. Oh, hold on, let me say one more thing here. Quite often, we want cases to go forward, or we ask, why won't the Supreme Court take this case? Or why won't they rule in this case? This is especially true after 2020 with what many perceived as election malfeasance and fraud. Why wouldn't the Supreme Court take the cases? There are several answers to that. The first one was already alluded to here. There has to be a previous law that they can look at, that they can say, this is or is not constitutional. The Supreme Court will not deal in hypotheticals. They won't say, well, if this happens, what are you going to do? They're not going to do that. So, first of all, you have to show harms. Now, in the case of elections, this is really, really problematic, because by the times you can show the harms, i.e., your candidate lost, they're already gearing up for the next administration and swearing people in and all the rest. And at that point, the Supreme Court is very hesitant to get involved in undoing government that is popularly elected, even if fraudulently popularly elected. And so you would probably say, well, what about 2000 and Bush v. Gore? And the answer is the court acted because of a constitutional time clock, a constitutional hourglass that was running out of sands that said that electors must be sent in by a certain date. And Al Gore's challenges were petitioning the court to extend that date. And the court did not want to go against the clear Constitution. So the court said no. Now, the second, and in my mind, far more important part of that case, which we'll look at way down the line, was that Gore wanted to recount votes in only 3 Florida counties, only the 3 counties that had large Democrat advantages. In other words, he only wanted to recount votes where he might get more votes to overcome Bush's 937 vote lead. Most people agree, if you had recounted the whole state, Gore would have lost, and probably by more, because they would have, quote, found more Republican votes in all of the red counties than Gore would have found in Broward, Miami-Dade, and I forget the third one, Palm Beach. So that's the first issue. The court needs to have a law that it can clearly act on. Second, the courts have shown they do not want to nibble around the edges. They don't want to take this little case and that little case and this and do a whole bunch. You know how it is with an old car when you start repairing it, and pretty soon you're fixing this and fixing that and fixing it. Before you know it, you basically built a whole new car one piece at a time. Court hates that. They won't do that. They want a big case, as with, for example, the Dobbs abortion case, where they can make a single ruling, send it back to the states, right? That's why they did not take the Texas case of abortion, because it was too messy. It had a number of things in that law that Texas passed that the court was going to have to separate out, and they don't like that. They want a nice, clean, this is good, this is bad, this is constitutional, this is unconstitutional. Third, I've been over this before, you have to have what's called standing. That is, you have to be an aggrieved party. If you can't show that you're an aggrieved party, the court's not going to hear your case. And so this has been one of the big problems with the election cases that, in my view, is both irrational and unconstitutional, which is, in the case of a federal election for president, vice president, or U.S. senator, I say every one of us voters have standing. In my view, just because I'm from Arizona and let's say fraud occurred in Michigan, it's still fraud that is affecting my vote because it's affecting the electoral college, which affects the president. That's how I would do standing. But between standing and harms, the courts have dodged and weaved and bobbed in not taking a lot of very high-profile cases, such as the transsexual cases that they're going to eventually have to take. They're going to have to take these. They're going to have to eventually take the election fraud cases. They're going to have to eventually take the Donald Trump cases, because there's just too much involved with the rights of an ex-president who has not been convicted of a crime by the Senate, which the Constitution says is the only way you can find him guilty of a crime. So those are two big ones as to why you're probably not seeing the cases that you think ought to be handled by the Supreme Court, why they're not touching them yet. The last is something called ripeness. This is a timing issue. It's kind of like hypotheticals, but not entirely. As seen here, the way Marshall dodged giving Marbury his job back was that he ruled that the original law was unconstitutional, that the case should have originated in a lower court. That's very important. In other words, Marshall didn't say, no, you don't have a right to the job. Marshall didn't say, no, you can't come back and see us later. He said, you made a mistake by not going up the food chain. You know how in the military, it's a very big deal for you to get outside the chain of command. If you're a sergeant, you have a problem, you report to the lieutenant. Lieutenant has a problem, he reports to the captain. Sergeant does not go to a major, and a lieutenant does not go to a general when they should be going up the chain of command. That's both good and bad. It's the same thing with court cases. The courts have lower courts for a reason, and they expect you to bring cases through lower courts for two reasons. One, the lower court might just handle it to your satisfaction. Then you'll keep it off the Supreme Court docket. But two, if it stays in the system and it reaches you in the Supreme Court, it now comes with precedent. In other words, they've done some of your work for you. They've done some of the looking up of the laws, research. They've also done some thinking, you would hope, about the case and why they reached the decision they did. So the judges can go, okay, this is sound reasoning according to the Constitution, or no, this is nuts. The Constitution says quite the contrary. So for reasons of rightness, not dealing with hypotheticals, standing, things like this, many of the 2020 election cases were not heard. But eventually, through Trump's Georgia trial, which involves election fraud claims, all of those may be heard. We'll have to see. So again, first paragraph on page 174. Equally as important as judicial review, however, Marshall's court consistently ruled in favor of capitalism, free markets, and free enterprise and open markets. Confirming the sanctity of private contracts in February 1819, the Supreme Court in Dartmouth College v. Woodward ruled that a corporate charter for Dartmouth College was indeed a contract that could not be violated at will by the state legislature. This supported a similar ruling in Sturgis v. Crowninshield. Contracts are contracts and are not subject to arbitrary revision after the fact. Some of the Marshall Court's rulings expanded federal power, no doubt, but at the same time, they unleashed market forces to race ahead of regulation. By the way, this is straight out of the Old Testament, right? Contracts are valid. They are covenants, and they are not to be broken. It's a very big deal. God made a covenant with Israel. Okay. For example, 5 years after Dartmouth, the Supreme Court held that only the federal government could limit interstate commerce. The case, Gibbons v. Ogden, involved efforts by famous Cornelius Vanderbilt, who ran a cheap water taxi service from New York to New Jersey for a steamboat operator named Thomas Gibbons. Their service competed against a New York firm that claimed a monopoly on the Hudson River, that one run by Robert Fulton. The Commodore boldly carried passengers in defiance of the claim, even offering to transport them on his People's Line, which flew the Jolly Roger flag, for nothing if they agreed to eat $2 worth of food on the trip. This is what's known as a loss leader in retail sales. You'll put something out there that is cheap, I don't know, an item of clothing or something, to get people in the store so they will buy something more expensive. Flying a flag reading "New Jersey must be free," Vanderbilt demonstrated his pro-consumer low-price projects over the next 30 years, and in the process won the case. So first, we have contracts are upheld by the Supreme Court. Second, we have the concept of competition is upheld by the Supreme Court. Lower courts took the lead from Marshall's rulings. For 30 years, American courts would favor developmental rights over pure or pristine property rights. This was especially explicit in the so-called Mill Acts, wherein state courts affirmed the primacy of privately constructed mills that required the owners to dam up rivers, thus eroding or destroying some of the property of farmers having land adjacent to the same river. Emphasizing the public good brought by the individual building of the mill, the courts tended to side with the person developing property as opposed to one keeping it intact. Legal historian James Willard Hurst labeled this propensity toward development a, quote, release of energy. a term that aptly captures the court's collective goal to unleash American entrepreneurs to serve the greater numbers of people. As policy, it pleased neither the hardcore anti-statists, who complained that it rightly put government authority on the side of some property owners as opposed to others, they did, nor in the latter 19th century progressives who demanded that all private property anyway, who distrusted all private property anyway and called for heavy taxation as a way to spur development. Let me explain it this way. You live on Lake Tahoe. You have a cabin there. You bought the land specifically on the side of the mountain so you could look down at this beautiful lake. Paid a lot of money for that. However, you only own the land that's, I don't know, let's say 3/4 of a square mile, half a square mile, I don't know, an acre, whatever it is. Along comes Harrah's Casino, and they buy the land below you and put up a giant office tower, not office, a giant hotel tower that blocks your view of Lake Tahoe. What are you going to do? Court says you got nothing. If you wanted that view, the court said, you should have bought the whole hill, or at least the whole view all the way down to the lake. Otherwise, it's not your land. A final pair of pro-business rulings came after Marshall was gone in the Charles River Bridge v. Warren Bridge and Bank of Augusta cases. The Charles River Bridge Company claimed its charter implicitly gave it a monopoly over bridge traffic, and thus sued Warren Bridge Company, which sought to erect a competing bridge across. Although many of the early colonial charters indeed had implied a monopoly power, that is, getting a charter said not only do you have a right to do business, but you had the right to do the only business of that type in town, i.e. the bridge. The court took a giant step away from those notions by ruling that monopoly powers did not exist unless they were expressly stated and delegated in the charter itself. This opened the floodgates to competition, for no company could hide behind its state-originated charters any longer. Then in 1839, in the Bank of Augusta v. Earl, a debtor from Alabama named Earl, seeking to avoid repaying his debts to the Bank of Augusta in Georgia, claimed the bank had no jurisdiction in Alabama. Appreciating the implications for stifling all interstate trade with a ruling against the bank, the court held that corporations could conduct business under laws of comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, or mutual good faith across state lines unless explicitly prohibited by the legislatures of the states involved. Again, the court opened the floodgates of competition by forcing companies to compete across state boundaries, not just within them. Taken together, these cases established the framework that allowed entrepreneurs in America to flourish. Now, this concept of comity we see in such things as marriage and divorce licenses. You're married in Arizona and you go move to Illinois, you're still married. You're divorced in New York, you go to California, you're still divorced. Where it did not apply was in the area of abortion. And this is specifically because the court said it's a state issue, let the state legislatures rule, and so they did. So we will see what happens here with various things as transsexual rights, as those seek to permeate through the states, and whether or not comedy is going to be recognized, or if it indeed, as is likely, will be dubbed a state issue. All right, well, that pretty well does it for today. Next time we will take up with the actual reading of Marbury v. Madison. Remember, I've got lots of books on the site. I know you haven't read them all. Take a look. My new biography, The Rhythm of History, is out. Check it out. It's not expensive. I think you would really enjoy many of my life's experiences, from rock drummer to professor to advisor to the U.S. Air Force to aerobics instructor to New York Times bestselling author to advisor to president. Check it out. Also, remember, I need your help turning Patriot's history into a feature film. Buy me a coffee. Please, please, please buy me a few coffees. If you like these, I'm not charging for them. Buy me a coffee once in a while. I'll see you guys back here on Wednesday.